Hello, welcome to Book Journey. Today, we are going to talk about Drunk in China, Baijiu, and the World's Oldest Drinking Culture, a book that combines both seriousness and lightheartedness. The serious part introduces the thousands of years of history of China's liquor industry, while the lighthearted part is the author's personal experiences with Chinese liquor and Chinese people. The author of this book, Derek Sandhaus, is an American who is very familiar with China. He came to work in China for 5 years right after graduating from university, and even gave himself a Chinese name, Deli. Later, he returned to China again due to his wife's job and lived in Chengdu. Through a series of coincidences, Deli became a passionate fan of Chinese liquor, especially the strong Baijiu. Derek discovered that the Chinese liquor industry is actually the largest in the world. Major Baijiu brands have long been at the top of the global liquor brand value list. In 2023, Chinese brands even occupied the top 5 spots on the spirits brand value list. However, despite their high value, these brands are mainly realized in the Chinese domestic market. Chinese liquors, especially Baijiu, have much lower recognition and acceptance abroad compared to other liquor brands. Think about it, in Chinese restaurants and bars, you can easily find foreign whiskeys and brandies, but Derek has never seen Chinese liquors abroad. Why is it that the delicious Chinese liquor he speaks of is unknown overseas? With these and other questions in mind, Derek's interest in Chinese liquor deepened, eventually leading him to become a Baijiu professional. He partnered with a famous Chinese Baijiu company to create a Baijiu brand for the overseas market and served as the global marketing director. The original English title of the book is a pun, which can be translated as both a drunkard in China and intoxicated by China. Therefore, this book is both a record of how he, as an enthusiast, fell in love with Chinese culture and liquor, and a comprehensive introduction to Chinese liquor based on his professional experience. It covers history, geographical characteristics, and even aspects such as how professional tasters describe the aroma of Baijiu and how to mix cocktails with Chinese liquors. Ultimately, he also found the historical reasons for the low overseas recognition of Chinese liquor brands and offered his own solutions. Of course, on the one hand, as a foreigner in China, Derek inevitably experienced cultural shocks. However, he did not wear tinted glasses to belittle China or look for strange things in China out of curiosity. Instead, he described his experiences in China objectively from an equal perspective. For example, he talked about the social faux pas caused by not understanding the drinking table culture. Therefore, Derek not only summarized the characteristics of Chinese liquor culture, but also identified the knowledge blind spots that Chinese people take for granted. On the other hand, as a Baijiu professional, some of his views lack scientific evidence. For example, he claimed that drinking Baijiu improved his health. We must emphasize that appreciating Chinese liquor culture, or enjoying tasting liquor, should always be based on moderation and never excessive drinking. So, let's follow this foreigner and start with the history of Chinese liquor. Then, we will look at the various types of liquor in modern China to understand the drinking culture. Finally, we will discuss the obstacles and solutions for Chinese liquor and Chinese culture to go global. Alright, when we talk about Chinese liquor, what often comes to mind is Baijiu. However, Baijiu actually appeared relatively late in Chinese history. Throughout history, there have been many different types of liquor in China. Moreover, archaeologically speaking, the history of Chinese liquor is even older than the history of Chinese civilization. This story begins with a jar of ancient wine discovered 9,000 years ago. This jar of ancient wine was found at the Jiahu site in Wuyang County, Wuhe City, Henan Province, China, hence the name Jiahu Ancient Wine. Since the discovery of the Jiahu site in 1961, there have been several large-scale archaeological excavations. The evidence unearthed shows that this was a highly mature Neolithic culture, dating back to between 9,000 and 7,500 years ago. It features the world's earliest rice remains, the world's earliest wind instruments, the world's earliest domesticated pigs and dogs, and of course, the world's earliest wine that we are discussing today. As early as the 1984 excavation, the Chinese archaeological team discovered pottery suspected to be used for brewing wine. Unfortunately, the technological conditions at the time were limited and could not prove it. It was not until 1999 that Professor Zhang Jizhong, from the University of Science and Technology of China, reached out to Professor McGovern from the University of Pennsylvania. McGovern is a leader in the field of molecular archaeology, specializing in prehistoric alcoholic beverages. They used the most advanced detection technology in the world at that time to confirm the presence of tartaric acid residues at the bottom of the pottery jars, thus proving that this 9,000-year-old pottery jar had stored the oldest wine ever found. Derek personally visited Professor McGovern, who referred to the Jiahu ancient wine as Neolithic grog. The term grog here refers to a cocktail made by mixing aged rum and honey with hot water. The Jiahu ancient wine was also a complex mixture. It was brewed from grapes, hawthorn, honey, and rice, and likely contained many sediments, requiring a straw for drinking. McGovern speculated that the fermentation method used at the time was chewing in the mouth, which involved chewing grains in the mouth and then spitting them out to utilize the enzymes in saliva to break down starch into sugars, promoting fermentation. This method of fermentation is common among primitive tribes around the world and is considered the earliest method of alcohol fermentation. Note that the Jiahu ancient wine contained rice, which the ancient people at that time might not have even invented agriculture for. In other words, the first taste of rice for the Chinese might not have been the aroma of rice, but the fragrance of wine. Historian Wu Qicheng from the Republic of China once speculated that the Chinese habit of eating rice actually originated from brewing wine. Paleoanthropologists have found that in fact, the quality of life for ancient people actually declined when they transitioned from a hunting and gathering society to an agricultural society, such as more labor, greater susceptibility to diseases, shorter lifespans, and insufficient and monotonous food sources. Therefore, some scholars speculate that the origin of agriculture was not for filling the stomach, but for brewing wine, and the Jiahu ancient wine is strong evidence for this theory. These ancient wines and wine vessels were basically discovered in tombs, alongside other precious religious totems and handicraft artworks, proving the ancients' fondness for wine. The wine jars found in the Jiahu tombs were placed beside the deceased's head. McGovern speculated that the ancients believed the deceased needed to drink wine in the afterlife. When we entered the period with written records, we could more clearly see that wine was used for ancestor worship, and drinking began to have rules, which can be called the oldest drinking table culture. In the pre-Qing period, both the Chuzi and the Book of Songs have many descriptions of wine used in sacrifices and many rules about drinking. For example, the Chuzi Dazhao records the grand scene of a sacrifice, in which one sentence says that the wine has a fragrant taste, suitable for chilling before drinking, and also to be careful not to let the servants steal it. There is another sentence saying to mix the sweet wine from the state of Wu with the clear wine from the state of Chu, showing that the wine at that time was already very diverse, which is also reflected in the characters. For example, the character for wine in Oracle Bone script, with water on the left and a wine pot on the right, does not refer to alcoholic beverages in general, but to a kind of sweet wine brewed from rice or millet. In addition, there is li, which is brewed from rice or millet and germinated grains, a kind of viscous light sweet wine. Lao, which is fermented from fruits and water. Lao, which is mixed with sediment. And a kind of sacrificial wine called chong, fermented from aromatic plants, flowers, and resins. In summary, the history of Chinese liquor has now reached 9,000 years, and the earliest Chinese liquors were not primarily fermented from grains, but were mixed wines used for the worship of the deceased. Subsequently, Chinese liquor quickly followed the political landscape of the Central Plains and entered a period of great unification, with a new brewing method giving rise to the popularity of Huangjiu, yellow rice wine. In the pre-Qin era, the ancients primarily consumed two types of grain-based alcoholic beverages, jiu and li. The process of brewing grain-based liquors is more complex than that of naturally fermenting fruit wines. It involves two steps. First, the starch in the grains must be broken down into sugars through a process known as saccharification, and then yeast is introduced to consume the sugars, producing alcohol and carbon dioxide in a process called fermentation. Li is brewed by promoting saccharification through the germination of grains, similar to the production of beer. During the Zhou dynasty, a new method emerged that utilized a type of mold known as chu. To cultivate this mold, grains are mixed with water and formed into rectangular blocks, which are then placed in a sealed room to dry slowly. Over time, various microorganisms from the environment, such as mold, yeast, and bacteria, gradually penetrate the blocks. After a period, the blocks are taken out and sun-dried to inhibit microbial growth, facilitating long-term storage. When it comes time to brew, the chu blocks are ground into powder and mixed with steamed grains. The mold in the chu converts the starch into sugars, the yeast ferments the sugars into alcohol, and other bacteria contribute unique flavors to the wine. The resulting liquor, which has a yellowish hue, is called Huangjiu. Huangjiu not only has a higher alcohol content, but also a richer flavor profile. Moreover, due to the different environmental conditions, the microbial communities in the chu blocks vary, leading to distinct flavors in the wines produced in different regions. As a result, Huangjiu quickly became the dominant beverage, outcompeting other types of alcohol. Later on, the chu used in brewing was also employed in vinegar production, food preservation, and the making of various sauces, all of which remain important sources of flavor in Chinese cuisine to this day. With such an efficient brewing technique, the ancients, who had entered the age of civilization, also became aware of the negative impacts of alcohol and no longer indulged in the intoxicating effects of alcoholic beverages. Instead, they began to regard alcohol as a symbol of moral decadence. For example, one of the crimes attributed to King Zhou of Shang was the wine pool and meat forest. The author notes that this concern has some scientific basis. Many Chinese people lack an enzyme called aldehyde dehydrogenase, which helps metabolize alcohol. Approximately 1 in 10 Chinese individuals are born without this enzyme. The absence of this enzyme makes it easier for people to flush when they drink, and this redness is not due to body heat, but rather an indication of bodily damage. Therefore, when to drink, how much to drink, and why to drink became questions that needed to be regulated. This falls under the category of rites, a reflection of the development of civilization. The most representative of these is the Confucian school of thought from the Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods. Confucius once said, "At all ceremonies, wine is indispensable." To a certain extent, the Confucian regulation of rites is centered around the regulation of alcohol. For example, in sacrificial rituals, the order of offering wine reflects the hierarchy of respect. Additionally, a gentleman should drink in moderation, only consuming 3 large cups at a time, which corresponds to the 3 offerings of wine in the sacrificial ceremony, representing respect for heaven, earth, and humanity. The author argues that in contrast to the Confucian restraint is the Taoist indulgence. He believes that the 7 sages of the bamboo grove from the Wei and Jin dynasties represent the Taoist view of drinking, which is to use wine to wash away one's constraints, allowing them to forget their identities and become the people they truly wish to be. Many Chinese poets who loved to drink also had experiences with Taoist practices. Moreover, with the development of brewing techniques and drinking philosophies, a large number of official positions related to alcohol emerged during the Zhou dynasty, many of which were associated with drinking etiquette. The later position of Baijiu initially referred to the eldest person in the sacrificial ceremony who would lead the drinking ritual. Over time, it evolved to have a supervisory meaning. These developments indicate that ancient political organizations began to attempt to control the brewing industry through rituals. The monopoly on brewing brought in substantial tax revenues for the ancient courts, which in turn further promoted the development of the brewing industry across various regions. Later on, there were Tao Yongming's lines, "Unconsciously I lose sight of self. How could I know what is precious? In wine's deep flavor I am lost," and Li Bai's verse, "Since ancient times, sages and worthies all are lonely, only drinkers leave behind their names." The wine consumed by these ancients was Huangjiu. The reign of Huangjiu was exceedingly long, and it underwent another technological advancement during the Song dynasty, with its brewing center shifting to the Jiangnan region, where it reached its peak. However, a new type of liquor was already in the making. Indeed, we are referring to Baijiu, the representative of Chinese liquor today. However, the author notes that Baijiu is neither an Eastern nor a Western drink. It is a product of fusion. Technically speaking, Baijiu is a distilled spirit. Simply put, distilled spirits utilize the characteristic that alcohol has a lower boiling point than water. By heating the liquor and collecting the alcohol vapor, which is then condensed back into a purer form of alcohol using a low-temperature container, the process is completed. The technology of distilling alcohol did not originate in China, but first appeared in Persia around the 8th century, initially used for making cosmetics rather than for drinking. This distillation technique likely entered China by the end of the Tang dynasty, as the term shaojiu, burnt wine, appears in Tang poetry. However, its widespread application probably began in the Yong dynasty, since the earliest Chinese description of alcohol distillation is found in the Ming dynasty's Compendium of Materia Mythica, which states, "The method of burning wine is not an ancient one. It was first created in the Yong era." With the technological transfer from the Song and Yong periods, and after local improvements, China invented the solid-state distillation method, which directly uses solid fermented grains to distill alcohol, preserving the unique flavor characteristics of the grains. These solid fermented grains utilize the Chinese-invented chu bricks, especially the dachu, made from a mixture of barley and wheat, which is now widely used in Baijiu production. This spirit, a fusion of various techniques, likely emerged during the Ming dynasty, but was not called Baijiu. It was simply referred to as burnt wine. Regardless, the alcohol content of distilled spirits is certainly higher than that of Huangjiu, making it more intoxicating. The strongest Huangjiu has an alcohol content of only about 15%. The weakest Baijiu, on the other hand, has an alcohol content of at least 40%. In times when technology was not advanced, ancients believed that the higher the purity of alcohol, the better the quality of the wine, thus forming a taste preference for stronger spirits. However, inferior burnt wines contained more impurities, making them unpalatable and lacking in flavor. To improve the taste, additional ingredients were added. For example, in the Qing dynasty, there were substandard Baijiu in Beijing that included pigeon droppings, which can be considered early fake liquors. Interestingly, the author shares a story here about Wu Song fighting the tiger. In his view, 3 cups of wine down the hatch, and you can't walk. After 18 cups, you can bare-handedly beat a tiger to death. That's the power of Baijiu. But this story has a more important side, reflecting another core of Chinese Baijiu culture at that time, masculinity. The stronger the liquor, the more dangerous it is, and the ability to control this danger represents the drinker's strength. Thus, the author says, this kind of competition shapes the relationships among Chinese men, who strive to prove that their alcohol tolerance is greater than others. This worship of strong spirits reflects the taste preferences of the main consumer group of Baijiu at that time, namely the vast working class. Compared to the delicacy of Huangjiu, the characteristic of Baijiu is its kick, which intoxicates easily. While light ruddy sipped Huangjiu and engaged in complex drinking games or elaborate sacrificial ceremonies, the lower-class laborers did not have such leisure. They needed a more efficient beverage. Baijiu perfectly met this requirement. Its raw materials could be moldy grains or sorghum, which was not widely consumed, and it could be distilled multiple times. Even the leftover dregs could be used to feed pigs, truly making the most of every resource. Most fundamentally, it was strong enough to be, as the author summarized, a potent drink that helps you forget fatigue and pain after a long day's work. In terms of taste, the most significant improvement in Baijiu might be erguoto. When we mention erguoto now, it might be thought of as a brand, but originally it referred to a special process of producing liquor. During the Kangxi reign, the alcohol distillation apparatus consisted of two pots. The lower pot contained fermented grains, and the upper one held cold water. As the grains in the lower pot were heated, alcohol vapor rose and was cooled by the bottom of the upper pot filled with cold water, flowing into a funnel between the two pots, which collected the distilled liquor. It is conceivable that the cold water in the upper pot would gradually heat up and needed to be constantly replaced. The Yusheng distillery in Beijing accidentally discovered that the liquor distilled after the second injection of cold water tasted the best, which is the origin of erguoto. The process of erguoto established a new procedure, namely cutting off the head and tail, discarding the liquor collected during the first and last cooling of cold water, and only retaining the heart of the liquor, significantly improving the quality of Baijiu. After the emergence of erguoto, Beijing became the center of China's Baijiu industry. By the 20th century, the scale of Beijing's Baijiu industry accounted for half of the country's total. Since the late Qing dynasty, emerging Baijiu industries in various places also began to attempt industrialization. For example, in 1919, Shaanxi established China's earliest Baijiu factory, but it was difficult to realize due to continuous wars. It was not until after 1949 that, under the leadership of the government, China integrated local brewing workshops to establish a number of large state-owned distilleries, such as Red Star, Motai, and Fangzhou, building a nationwide Baijiu industry. From top to bottom and breaking the monopoly of family-inherited brewing secrets, truly laying the foundation for modern Baijiu. The consumer base of Baijiu also began to spread from the bottom up, permeating throughout society and even making its way onto state banquets. After discussing the history, let's talk about modern Chinese liquor. After investigating the history of Chinese liquor, the author of this book, Derek, designed a tasting journey for himself, exploring liquors from different regions of China and experiencing various aspects of Chinese culture. Here, I will select a few stories from his journey as entry points to discuss the characteristics of Chinese liquor culture. First, let's address the most fundamental question: on what occasions do people drink? In contemporary China, it is at banquets where drinking takes place, and the more upscale and formal the banquet, the more likely it is that high-grade liquor, often strong, Baijiu, will be served. These banquets often mark the beginning of a business deal or a relationship, and frequently, the guests are not considered to have had a good time unless they are drunk, adhering to the principle of no return without intoxication. For example, Derek mentioned the state banquet during the normalization of Sino-American relations, which highlighted the differing perceptions of alcohol between the two cultures. The book notes that in 1972, when China resumed contact with the United States and President Nixon prepared to visit, a crucial part of his itinerary was to attend a state banquet, which of course included fine liquors, specifically Motai. However, the renowned Oxford historian Margaret Macmillan discovered from declassified archives that after the American advance team experienced the Chinese banquet, they urgently warned Nixon, under no circumstances should the president drink what is in his glass when responding to a toast. This was not because foreigners did not understand Chinese toasting etiquette, but rather out of concern that the inexperienced and fond of drinking Nixon might get drunk at an important occasion. Nevertheless, when Premier Joe toasted, holding his glass of liquor next to Nixon and inviting him to drink together, Nixon disregarded the advance team's warning and took a sip, laying a solid foundation for the normalization of Sino-American relations. In Derek's hometown of the United States, you would find that during meals, strong spirits are rarely consumed. Instead, lower alcohol beverages such as wine and beer are chosen to accompany the food. Moreover, a drinking party usually takes place after the business is concluded as a celebration. If strong spirits are to be drunk, it is often in a bar, and Americans consider getting truly drunk to be particularly indecent and dangerous, which is why they were concerned about Nixon drinking too much. Thus, although Derek had already learned to appreciate Baijiu, he initially found it difficult to integrate into the drinking culture. He always felt that he could not truly appreciate Baijiu at banquets. He thought at the time that separating Baijiu from those intimidating banquet situations seemed like an ideal way to unravel the mystery of Baijiu. It was only later that he gradually realized that Chinese liquors should be tasted within the context of Chinese culture to savor their unique flavors. Speaking of which, we cannot avoid discussing Chinese drinking table culture. The author attended countless banquets in China, and his understanding of Chinese liquor deepened, but what left a strong impression on him was in Henan, the birthplace of Chinese liquor. Derek's itinerary in Henan was entirely led by the warm and hospitable locals, which also allowed him to experience the uniqueness of the Chinese dining table more profoundly. For instance, Chinese dining tables are round. In the West, this often symbolizes equality, as exemplified by King Arthur and his knights using a round table to signify equal status. However, in China, the Confucian emphasis on respecting hierarchy during drinking has persisted for thousands of years. If one pays attention, every seat at the dining table corresponds to a social rank. The pattern observed by the author in Henan matches my own experience in Shandong. The seat farthest from the door is the seat of honor, and the further away from this seat, the lower the importance. In his understanding, the seat of honor is also the best position to observe people coming and going, hence its prestigious status. Interestingly, the dining etiquette he learned in South China did not apply in Henan. He found the Henan dining table to be unfair. At the banquet, the hostess first filled his teacup with wine and invited him to drink, but did not pour any for herself. Although Derek was somewhat puzzled, he drank it in one go. After several rounds, he realized that the aunt had not drunk a single sip, while he had already downed several cups. According to the rules he had learned in South China, drinking should involve both offering to others and drinking oneself. He complained to a Henan uncle that if this continued, they would all get drunk while the hosts remained sober. The uncle explained that in Henan, if the host raises a glass, it means inviting everyone to drink, but the host does not necessarily have to drink. This is because in the past, when resources were scarce and wine was a treasure, it was brought out to entertain guests. Therefore, to be a good host, the host used this method to let the guests enjoy a few more cups. What the author did not realize is that this struggle for fairness reflects a core concept of traditional Confucian thought. Traditional Confucianism does not advocate equality for all, but rather emphasizes a hierarchical order, where different positions should receive corresponding treatment. This has been preserved in Chinese rural culture, and Fei Xiaotong later summarized it as the differential mode of association, which is a manifestation of this cultural mindset. At the dining table, allowing guests to enjoy the good things first and drink a few more cups of fine wine is rooted in the Confucian tradition of respecting hierarchy as a way to show respect to the guests. In the South, however, due to the earlier development of the market economy and earlier contact with Western culture, Another method of showing respect to guests has been accepted, namely equality, which distinguishes it from the more traditional Central Plains dining table. Derek remarked, "This is the indelible impression that the Central Plains has left on me, and everything begins from here. Rivers may dry up, mountains may turn to dust, but people and traditions will endure." However, Chinese liquor is not only used for mutual respect at banquets, but also as a medicinal wine for nourishing the body. Traditional Chinese culture emphasizes the concept of food and medicine sharing the same origin, and as a common beverage, liquor can naturally be used for health preservation. The Book of Han refers to medicinal wine as the leader of all medicines. Derek also had some profound experiences in this regard. For example, he tasted a traditional yellow rice wine in Fujian, which used a fermentation starter containing 32 types of herbs. The resulting wine was not yellow but red, and he described its taste as reminiscent of Western sherry, with a light texture. However, he was also shocked by the medicinal wine he saw in South China. He described the scene: each shelf displayed a different kind of grotesqueness, only partially recognizable animals and plants, herbs, spices, and mixtures of both, and whole animals, reptiles, mammals, and crustaceans, the animals' whitened eyes, fixed in the moment of death. The most perplexing to him were the medicinal wines soaked with animal genitalia, but he tried deer penis wine with a stiff upper lip, describing it as rich in flavor, with a syrupy, thick cinnamon taste. Here, we must also note that the effects of many medicinal wines have not been scientifically verified, and there is a lack of standard formulas on the market. Some of the base wines used for soaking medicine are homemade, posing significant safety risks and requiring caution. In summary, today's Chinese liquor culture still reflects many traditional Chinese cultural concepts. Tasting Chinese liquor is not only about savoring the flavors of local terroir in fermentation, but also the flavors within different cultures. Finally, let's discuss how the author views the overseas perception of Chinese liquor and how he helps Chinese liquor go global. As mentioned earlier, Chinese liquor has low recognition and acceptance abroad. However, the author discovered that this was not always the case. In the early 19th century, there was actually a Baijiu craze in the West. At that time, Guangzhou was the only port in China open to foreign trade, and it was there that European sailors first tasted a drink called samshu. Originally referring to a type of rice wine distilled 3 times, the term samshu was later used by the British to refer to all spirits produced using Chinese techniques. In 1836, a British record noted that samshu was ubiquitous in Chinese ports, and they were very concerned about their sailors becoming addicted to this strong liquor. The author found that from various accounts of samshu, we see that Europeans not only found this drink very attractive, but drinkers were willing to risk fatal injuries, theft, and military trials for it. Ironically, in 1839, a brawl caused by drunken sailors on a British merchant ship led to the death of a local villager, which further prompted Lin Zexi to announce the suspension of Sino-British trade and the expulsion of the British, triggering the Opium War. According to historical records, the liquor that caused the British sailors to cause trouble was likely samshu baijiu. Later on, as China became a semi-colonial and semi-feudal society, everything Chinese was seen as a symbol of barbarism and backwardness in the eyes of Westerners. In particular, the Yellow Peril theory spread in the United States, sparking a large-scale anti-Chinese movement. While they acknowledged the deliciousness of Chinese cuisine, they denigrated its quality, claiming it contained rat meat and addictive drugs, labeling it as a dirty, cheap, and inferior diet. This prejudice was so deeply ingrained that as late as 2015, Derek could still see comments in a New York Times article about Baijiu, comparing it to airplane fuel, kerosene, nail polish remover, sewage cleaner, and brine from a garbage heap. Derek sternly refuted this by saying, the idea that the Chinese deliberately produce and consume a beverage that they detest is absurd and condescending. This view assumes that Chinese distilleries are either incompetent or malicious, and that Chinese drinkers are either too stubborn or too foolish to try other beverages. He pointed out that such evaluations of Chinese liquor are made in a cultural vacuum, which is overly critical of Chinese liquor. Therefore, for Chinese liquor to go global, it is necessary to fill this cultural void. For example, it is essential to invent a suitable vocabulary to describe the flavors of the liquor. Although China has classifications based on aroma types, such as strong aroma, light aroma, sauce aroma, and rice aroma, these terms are not very intuitive and are difficult to translate. The author personally participated in the creation of a set of Chinese tasting language. He described the taste of motai as having fermented beans, wild mushrooms, bitter herbs, and roasted nuts, strong aroma Baijiu as having the aroma of tropical fruits, white pepper, and star anise, and light aroma Baijiu as having the scent of grilled vanilla, chrysanthemum, and pine needles. He emphasized that these flavors have their own cultural background and appear in a dietary environment of aged vinegar with noodles, boiled beef, and sour soup with pickles. For tasters who have not been exposed to the Chinese dining table with the concept of food and medicine sharing the same origin, these flavors may seem too complex. In his later promotion team, he tried to create a stable tasting discourse, using things more familiar to Westerners to describe flavors. For example, he used dark soy sauce to describe the savory taste of motai, kiwi, and pineapple instead of dragon fruit and lychee, and British Worcestershire sauce to replace the description of fermented black bean flavor. The author believes that as China continues to develop, the economic basis for anti-Chinese prejudice will gradually fade away. He hopes that more people will participate in the process of cultural translation and exchange because, just as a society can be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members, the openness of a society must also be judged by how it responds to the most incomprehensible parts of other cultures. In other words, in his view, helping foreigners understand China is not about saving Chinese culture. On the contrary, it is the West that needs to overcome the arrogance left over from the colonial era, and Chinese liquor happens to be a key for both sides to understand each other.